Welcome. A very warm greetings to all. Thank you for joining us again for another Pariyatti Presents event. My name is Briha Sarathi, and I'm here on behalf of Pariyatti as its Executive Director. We're grateful that you've all joined us today. For those of you who are not already familiar with Pariyatti, we're a non-profit charitable organization based in the USA. Our mission is to enrich the world by disseminating the words of the Buddha, providing sustenance for the seeker's journey, and illuminating the meditator's path. Pariyatti imports books from around the world, reprints books, and publishes new titles and converts existing material into digital formats. We protect and provide an enormous catalog of Dhamma resources in many languages and formats that otherwise would not be as easily available. We offer many free services, such as the Pariyatti Learning Center, Treasures of Pariyatti, Dhamma Storytime, and Daily Words for Inspiration, via email, RSS feeds, and our mobile app. We offer most audio and video material, as well as many eBooks and audiobooks free of charge, including a large number of resources for students of SN Goenka. We also organize donation-based residential Pali workshops and facilitate pilgrimages for Vipassana meditators. For more information on Pariyatti, please visit our website at pariyatti.org. Please note that in order to ensure a seamless experience for our audience, we've chosen to pre-record this introduction as well as a subsequent conversation with Venerable Shravasti Dhammika. The question and answer portion of this event will be live, and Venerable Dhammika will be responding to the questions we received during the event. So please feel free to send your questions via the chat feature in Zoom, and send them to the user named Send Questions Here. So for today's event, Kory Goldberg will be interviewing Venerable Shravasti Dhammika. By way of introduction, Venerable Dhammika was born in Australia in 1951 into a Christian family, and he converted to Buddhism at the age of 18. In 1973, he went to Thailand with the intention of becoming a monk, and from there to Laos, Burma, and finally India. For the next 3 years, he traveled around India learning yoga and meditation, and finally ordained under Venerable Mattiwala Sangharatna, the last disciple of Anagarika Dharmapala. In 1976, he went to Sri Lanka, where he studied Pali at the Sri Lanka Vidyalaya, and later became one of the co-founders of the Nilambe Meditation Center and one of its teachers. Since then, he spent most of his time in Sri Lanka and Singapore. Bhante Dhammika has written over 25 books and scores of articles on Buddhism and related subjects. He's also well known for his public talks, and he represented Theravada Buddhism at the European Buddhist Millennium Conference in Berlin in 2000. Interviewing Venerable Dhammika today is Kory Goldberg. Kory Goldberg has a PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada, and he teaches ethics, critical thinking, religion, and sustainability at Champlain College in Saint-Lambert, Quebec. He co-authored Along the Path, Meditator's Guide to Pilgrimage in the Buddha's Land, and he is the general editor of the Pariyatti Journal, as well as a Vipassana meditator in the tradition of SN Goenka. So without further ado, I give you Venerable Dhammika and Kory.
So welcome, Bhante. This is a real honor and privilege to be speaking with you today. I've followed your work for the last 20-something years of my life.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Starting with Middle Land, Middle Way.
Right. Okay.
And so that was a really great resource in my early days when I would travel in India. And then we did meet in Bodh Gaya back in 2007 or 8. And so it's nice to be able to speak again with you today. So before asking people about their work, I sometimes like to hear about their Dhamma journey first. So can you please tell us your story about how you came to the Dhamma and why you decided to become a bhikkhu rather than practice as a layperson?
Okay, well, I was born into a nominal Christian family in a country, Australia, which is not known for its religiosity. But for some reason, from an early period, I was interested in religion. I actually went to church on my own accord rather than my parents telling me that I should go. But by the time I was about 16 or 17, I realized it wasn't for me. And then I started looking around for something else. And this was a period when the religious people like the Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on the door, I would actually invite them in. And my mother always used to say, tell them to get rid of them, don't do that. But anyway, I found out that it was basically a different version of the same thing. And then one day I came across a book by the Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang. And in it, he had extracts from various Eastern religions, including passages from the Dhammapada. And that attracted my attention. And then I started looking for books on Buddhism, and I came across a book called The Mind Unshaken by John Walters, who was, at that time in the 50s, he was the London Times correspondent in Burma. And it's just about how and why he became a Buddhist and what Buddhism is. And when I read that, I sort of got the feeling that I wasn't learning anything new, but I was sort of being reminded of something that I'd known but forgotten. And I didn't, of course, understand or comprehend all of it, but what I did made me think that, well, if that's Buddhism, then I'm a Buddhist. So from that time onwards, I considered myself a Buddhist. Then I joined a Buddhist society in Sydney at that time. And then I just got more and more involved in it. And I think, like a lot of Western Buddhists in those days, when there was much less material available, it took a while to muddle my way through. For example, I remember, I think there's a 3-volume collection of D.T. Suzuki's talks, which I thought, wow, Zen Buddhism, that sounds interesting. To this day, I have no idea what on earth he was talking about. So it took me a while to sort of discover what you'd call Theravada Buddhism. And then that was very clear to me that that's what I wanted. And then you asked, why did I become a monk? And I'll tell you quite honestly, because I really had no idea what I was getting into. I mean, and I don't think, maybe it's a little bit different now, but I think most Westerners who become monks, they're just not prepared for not only being in a very, very different culture, but also if they've had the experience of knowing something about Buddhism, going to a culture where it doesn't always seem as if those teachings have had much of an effect, at least in many aspects of life. So anyway, that's what I decided to do. So I went to Thailand. It didn't, as you Americans say, it didn't resonate with me very much. Then I went to Laos, and on the way back, somebody told me that there is a pra-araham, an arahat up there in that part of the country. But I'd seen enough sort of arahats, with tattoos and smoking, that I really didn't want to see another one. It could have been Achan Chah that the person was talking about, and had I bothered to go and meet him, my trajectory might have been very different. Anyway, I left Thailand, I went to Burma, and I had very positive experiences there. And in those days, you were only allowed to stay there for 7 days. So I went back and forwards, Bangkok, Rangoon 3 times.
What years are we talking about here?
That was 1974, early 74. I did a meditation course there with a teacher called U Panadipa, who had some reputation as a teacher and knew English. And so then I went on to India, and I was there for 2 or 3 years. I did yoga, but primarily I was looking for a place where I could become a monk. And eventually I ended up, and at the same time wanting to visit all of the Buddhist places. And so I ended up in Shravasti ewang mi sutang ekang samayang bhagawa sawatiyang. And the Sri Lankan monk there who was looking after pilgrims and that seemed to be a really interesting character, very learned in Buddhism. He lived in India for more than 50 years. So he offered to fulfill my wish to become a monk, and so that's where I became a monk. And then he'd already started teaching me some Pali, how to chant the Mangala Sutta, the Metta Sutta, etc. But then he said to me, quite honestly, you're not going to really learn very much in India. Go to Sri Lanka. So I went to Sri Lanka. I studied in Sri Lanka Vidyalaya in Colombo, which was a fairly good monastic college. Then after a year, I went off by myself. And then altogether, I lived in Sri Lanka about 20 years. But when the civil war started to get ugly, I decided to leave. I went to Singapore. I was taken under the wing of a senior Sri Lankan monk there, Venerable Dhammaratana. We've remained friends ever since. And he was a very exceptional person, not necessarily deeply spiritual, but very, very committed to promoting the Dhamma in Singapore. So, and then in the end, people invited me to set up another Buddhist society. And so I ran that until 2017, when I thought that, 43 years teaching the Dhamma, I'd done my bit, you might say. Yeah. So I returned to Australia, and that's where I am now. I live on a small island off the coast. It's about 80% national park here. I live right on the edge of the forest. It's a nice place to sort of go into your dotage. So now I just...
You're still teaching to some degree online and...
well, that was not my plan, actually, but it so happens that I don't mind doing Zoom talks every now and then. Mm-hmm. And I have a very, very large library, my most precious resource. And so I'm doing perhaps more writing now than I have before. And then the rest of the time is either pottering in the garden or meditating. Almost nobody comes here, so I've got nobody to talk to, which is nice. And so that's my story.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I can't imagine you're going to keep writing, because I believe you've written more than 30 books on a variety of themes concerning Buddhist history, Buddhist culture, philosophy, practice. And so do you see this outpouring of scholarship as a part of your Dhamma practice, or is it something else?
Well, over the years, I've met quite a lot of Western monks, and indeed some monks from traditional Asian countries. And you sometimes notice that after a while, they've sort of burnt out. That might not be the right word. They know it all, and now it's just sort of repeating the same thing. That hasn't happened to me. Every time I open the Tipitaka and that, I inevitably either find something that I didn't know before. That's not so common, but think about it. It prods me to think about some aspect of the Dhamma differently than I did before. So my fascination with it hasn't declined at all. Wonderful. And I still think that there is so much more that could be said. For example, I've just finished writing an article on not what the Buddha said, but how he said it. That is, the tone and timbre of his voice, the impact that his voice, quite apart from what he said, had on his audience. Now, there's not a lot in the Tipitaka about it, but there's sufficient for a short article on the subject. Wow. And then I just finished another one on... muddled around in this subject for a while, what the Buddha had to say about sickness, health, medicine, and healing. And there is quite a lot. And of course, that's been touched on before, but I think I've covered everything. I hope so. It'll be published soon.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I look forward to reading that article on the Buddha's speech, because I often find right speech, tone and timbre, as you say, is a really important part of right speech, which we don't necessarily think about all the time.
And how you actually say something, whether you shout it or you whisper it, that adds an extra dimension to the actual content of the speech too. So I think in the case of the Buddha, this may have had some influence on why he was able to attract such large numbers of people, not just what he said, and of course how he presented himself generally, but including his voice.
Great. So the main topic of today's interview really concerns one of your most recent books, the biographical account of the Buddha's life, entitled Footprints in the Dust, The Life of the Buddha from the Most Ancient Sources. But before we go down that path, I do want to ask you a couple of questions about pilgrimage. So your pilgrimage books, Middle Land, Middle Way, about the pilgrimage circuit in India, Navel of the Earth, which is specifically about Bodh Gaya, Sacred Island, which is the guide to Sri Lanka, as well as your writings about Mount Kailash in Tibet and Borobudur in Indonesia. So I've noticed you're quite, you've written a lot about travel, and these really nicely provide, excuse me, the ones that I've read are nice historical and archaeological insights into these places, highlighting the Buddha's life and teachings. And as I said earlier, on a personal level, Middle Land, Middle Way was really an inspiration for the pilgrimage guidebook that I co-wrote with my wife, Along the Path, which is actually replete with references to your book.
Is it?
Oh yeah. There's lots of references.
I've always liked you, but now I like you more.
And I give you credit.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful.
So just to start, a very general question, what motivated you to write all these travel books or pilgrimage books?
I think it was probably when I arrived in India and buying a ticket from Calcutta to Gaya with the intention of going to Bodh Gaya. And I remember very vividly arriving very early in the morning in Gaya when it was dark. And I mean, talk about the city of dreadful night. Very early in the morning, it was dark, it was cold. And I took a tonga, a horse and cart, to Bodh Gaya. And in those days, the only road ran along the river. Nowadays, you go the other way. But, and it was as we were going along the river, sort of click, clock, the sun started to come up and it sparkled on the water, and you had the first birds coming out, those lovely bright blue birds, what are they called? Indian roller on the wires or on the branches of trees, and across the river those sort of purple mountains. And it just moved me very much. And as we approached Bodh Gaya, above the trees, I saw the pinnacle, just the top of the Mahabodhi temple. And I had, I think in the first time in my life, what you'd call a profoundly uplifting experience. I mean, I knew what it was the temple, but I felt an intense and peaceful joy. And that has remained with me ever since. And so my first experience of Bodh Gaya was very, very positive. And it was positive in other ways too. In those days, the monk who ran the Mahabodhi Society, Venerable Panyarama, was a really lovely person. And India is not an easy place to travel in. You often have frustrating experiences, and sometimes more than that. And he was just so welcoming and friendly, and he was just such a lovely, sanguine person. I'm not the only one who knew him like that. So my whole experience there was positive. And once again, Buddha in those days, 1974, was very different from now. It was little more than a small village. And I think that's what led me to have an interest in visiting places. First of all, visiting places to know that the places that are mentioned in the Tripitaka. Another experience I had was before I wrote Middle Land, Middle Way, I spent a bit of time. I spent about a month in Rajagaha or Rajgir. And one of the places I discovered, because I read very voraciously all the old archaeological reports, was the Indusala cave, which is the background to the Sakapana Sutta. And I don't know what it's like today. I've only been back once. But anyway, I was just so taken to, when I went into it, to think that the stones that my feet are touching now, the Buddha may well have touched. And I ended up spending 2 nights in the cave, and I highly do not recommend it. At least in those days, it was full of bats and damp. But it really didn't have an effect upon me. It was a very, very... to think that you may actually be touching something that the Buddha touched. It just, once again, it was a wonderful experience. And so I think that's sort of why, and later on when I got interested in Buddhist sculptures, then I wanted to go to places that, as you said, Borobudur or Mount Kailash, and these places still, generally uplift me to one degree or another.
So you wanted to share that upliftment, that sense of joy with other people. That's what motivated you.
Well, yes. In fact, that book has been in print since it was published, and it's in Sinhala, so Sri Lankan people read it, and it's in Indonesian. Indonesians read it, and parts of it are in some other languages. And it's the only book that I ever got letters from people from. Of course, it was written before the internet, or at least before I knew anything about the internet. And I actually got letters from people saying, I remember one person saying, it brought it all alive for me. And I noticed that that book written by the Thai forest monks in London, in UK, what's it called? Rude Awakening. Yes. In the back of their book, they say, if we'd have found the book, known the book before we went, we'd have learnt much more and had less adventures. So I'm glad that people have sort of responded to the book positively.
Yeah, so Rude Awakenings, I really enjoyed that book.
That's a wonderful, wonderful book.
Yeah, by Ajahn Sucitto and Nick Scott.
Yes.
That was part 1, and then they wrote part 2, which was called The Great Patient One.
I haven't, I've seen it, I'm aware of it, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, so what I really enjoyed about those books is that it tells the story of a layman and a bhikkhu who do the whole pilgrimage on foot. And I believe you've also had the rare opportunity and courage to travel parts of the Yatra circuit by foot. Are there any highlights and challenges of those journeys that you can share with us?
I don't think I had any. It was tough. Once again, this was in the late 70s, and one of the trips was in the early 80s. No, I don't think I ever had any difficulty other than the difficulties of walking and through a country like India. I went for Pindapata everywhere, and the food I got was not particularly wholesome or even particularly clean. People, and often the poorest people, gave me at least something, a battered and black banana or a spoonful of ghee or all sorts of things, or things with flies in them, and I never got sick.
Wow.
What else? No, I never really had any challenges.
And what about highlights? Was there any one or two? Are there any one or two highlights that you might recall off the top of your head?
Well, one is that, but it wasn't in that part of India. It was in Maharashtra when I visited the three great cave monasteries, Bhaja, Bedsa, and Kaniri, the other one. I can't remember the name now. Anyways, a group of people tried to, I suspect, tried to murder me. It's Bedsa is, to my mind, the jewel of ancient Indian architecture. It is magnificent, cut out of the living stone, and it has almost a Zen-like simplicity to it. It's a remarkable place, and I've been back twice since then because I love it so much. And anyway, what happened is when I got to the foot of the hill, it's quite a steep, it's on the side of a very steep hill, a shepherd boy offered to carry my bowl and my bag up. And I thought, oh, I can give him 5 rupees or something for it. And you know, that'll help him maybe. Anyway, when I came down, all his friends were waiting for me. All poor shepherd boys, all with long canes, and all very determined that they were going to get more than 5 rupees from me. I won't go into the details, but I was very, very frightened, and I think I had good reason to be. Anyway, I managed to escape, and that's the only time I ever had any close shaves in India. Particularly in the south of India, because in the end I decided, after I became a monk, I forgot to tell you, I decided to walk from North India to Sri Lanka. That's another story. Wait until my autobiography comes out.
I look forward to reading that. Okay, so now let's shift our attention to Footprints in the Dust. And I must say, this is one of the best biographies of the Buddha that I've read. And I say that with all sincerity. You do an excellent job of describing the Buddha as a mendicant, as a teacher, as a counselor, and perhaps most importantly, as a human being who, like the rest of us, must deal with the daily challenges of samsara. And so it was very inspiring. So really, thank you for that contribution to our understanding of the Buddha and his teaching. And so as I asked with the previous books, what inspired you to write this kind of biography?
Well, many years ago, long before I was a monk, I read Herman Oldenburg's book, The Buddha, His Teaching and His Order, which he wrote in, I think, 1881, and was translated into English the next year, 1882. And I think it's been in print both in German and in English ever since. And it was a pioneering work. But in the beginning, somewhere in there, he has a small chapter, I think it's only 3 pages or perhaps less, on the Buddha's character. And I remember that. And all based only on the Pali Tipitaka. And then years later, I read Schumann's book, The Historical Buddha. And he did the same thing, probably following in Oldenburg's footprints. In fact, about just before I started writing that book, my book, in a secondhand bookshop, I found a copy of Schumann's book, I had read it years earlier in that. But anyway, I reread it, and that was the trigger, because although his book, like almost all accounts of the Buddha's life, mix up the later stories and legends with information from the Pali Tipitaka, he also has some archaeological information about places where the Buddha went. And he has a small chapter on the Buddha's personality, what he was like as a person, how he presented himself to others and that. So that was the straw that was taken off and prevented the camel's back from being broken. That's what actually, so that was about 7 or 8 years ago, and then it took me a year or two to actually start the project. And actually, when you think of it, it's rather unusual that there's so many biographies of the Buddha, and other than these two, they're really the only ones that I know who have anything about what the Buddha looked like, or what other people thought of him, or how he responded to criticism, and why the criticism that people directed towards him. It's actually unusual when you think about it. So I don't know why it's taken so long for somebody to do something based only on the earliest sources. Yeah. Even I think it's Nakamura's 2-volume work. It's subtitled based on the earliest sources, and yet it has the Lalita Vistara, quotes from the Lalita Vistara and the Mahavastu, which, that's 500 or 600 years after the Buddha. My book is based only on the information in the Tipitaka.
I really like in the introduction how you outline how people's perceptions of the Buddha have varied from the time that he was alive up to today. So maybe just in a nutshell, what are different mistaken perceptions that people have had?
Oh, mistaken perceptions on the Buddha. How much time have we got? Well, I'll mention one or two. One is it's very clearly a response to ideas that are current today, is that if you say anything that may upset or somebody might disagree with it, that's definitely a no-no. And so one gets the impression that the Buddha was sort of just walking around agreeing with everybody because he was so nice. And that's certainly not how he's presented in the Tipitaka. He challenged people, and sometimes he challenged them a lot. And sometimes they responded quite negatively, but not always. I think of, what's the name of that sutta? About the Arita, who was a vulture trainer or a vulture killer, who got it into his head that practicing the Dhamma doesn't mean that you can't have a good time with your girlfriend or your boyfriend. And the Buddha put him straight very, very quickly and very firmly. So, and he didn't always have particularly positive things to say about the other faiths at this time. He was always polite, but he could be challenging. So I think that the Buddha wasn't somebody who just agreed with everybody and never upset anybody. And indeed, in the Abhaya Rajakumar Sutta, somebody asked him, could you ever say anything that would upset people? And he said, yes. But if I did, I'd make sure that I was informed of what they taught. Secondly, I'd do it at the right time. And thirdly, my motivation would always be compassion, that is, to help them to get a better understanding. So that's one thing I can think of. Of course, the other one was that the Buddha denied that he was human. Now, this goes back to a confusion between Mahayana, or some branches of Mahayana, and early Buddhism. So that sort of muddies the waters, causes some confusion. But it seems to me when it comes to Pali Buddhism, it goes back to the sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, where somebody asks the Buddha, "What are you?" And it's actually, when it was first translated, there was a mistake made in the translation. So the question is not actually, what are you? Bhavisati. The question was, what will you become? So in the original translation is, what are you? Are you a deva? Are you a this? Are you a that? Are you a human being? To each of which the Buddha said, no. And so people have taken that to mean that the Buddha did not consider himself to be human, that he was some sort of divinity. And it's just really quite interesting how frequently you see this repeated and the conclusions drawn from it. Now, even though I think it was F.L. Woodward translated that sutta correctly with a note explaining the error, in 1930 something, his translation, and yet still people keep on quoting, oh no, the Buddha didn't consider himself to be a human.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think people wanted to deify the Buddha?
Well, I don't think they necessarily wanted to. I think it's just sloppy scholarship, quite honestly. Although maybe, I think in some cases they want to discredit. You know, you Buddhists say that you're different and you don't have a God, but, you know, the Buddha was a God. And but the others, it's just very repeating what has been repeated before. I see this quite a lot. I won't mention the name of the person, but just recently I saw a well-known Western teacher say, Buddhism considered animals to be on the same level as humans, meaning that it's no different. You treat them both the same. It's a small point, perhaps, but it could lead to some confusion. You mean a cockroach is equal to a human being? And it's very clear that the Buddha did not. So, for example, in the Vinaya, the penalty for murder is expulsion, and you can never be ordained again. The penalty, that is for a monk or a nun, the penalty for killing an animal is far, far less. In other words, he considered the life of a human being to be much more important and significant than that of an animal. So only a small point, but I think you could write a decent-sized book on some of the things that are said about the Buddha and Buddhism that are just not based on facts.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, what might be some of the dangers when people deify, whatever the reason, whether it's scholarship or it's religious sentiment or whatever it is, what are the dangers of this deification, and how might this alter people's understanding of the Dhamma as it's explained in the earlier sources?
Well, one would be, of course, that it makes it much more likely that people will come to this conclusion. In fact, all religions are basically the same. You know, you've got Buddha, we've got God, they've got Allah. They're all the same. They're not all the same. So that's one thing. Another thing would be, of course, I think it was extremely important that the Buddha is seen as a human being. Because if he was a deity, then we can never become like a deity. But if he was a human being who, by his own efforts, by his own energy and determination, as he clearly says, that he freed himself completely from all the negative states, greed, hatred, and delusion, then if he did it, we can. And I think that was a fundamental principle. That's why the Buddha went around teaching for 45 years. So if you thought he was a deity, then your whole understanding of the spiritual life would be very different. So I think it's very important that we see the Buddha as a human being, and in some ways as an ordinary human being. I mean, I have some references. Two that stick in my mind was before the Buddha would enter a building, he would lean down and wash his own feet. Why not? Well, because he was an ordinary human being who got dust on his feet when he walked on dusty roads. Or that the Buddha is giving a sermon and he sneezes. Why shouldn't he? I suspect he might have even picked his nose sometimes. I mean, okay. So little things like that. And it's surprising how many there are. The Buddha mentioning that he's got a backache, and Ananda coming out, the Buddha sitting in the late afternoon sun warming his back because he's got a backache, and Ananda coming up and massaging his back. So I think that's very important. It's also important to realize that he wasn't an ordinary human being in all respects. In fact, psychologically, he was, far, far beyond us, but still within reach because he was human.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I really like the part in the book where you talk about how the Buddha experienced back pain, because when we look at so many of these, statues of the Buddha, he's always depicted as with this very straight back and very strong. And in at least in my imagination, he must never have any back pain. He's just meditating and experiencing jhanic, joy and rapture, and there'd be no physical pain ever. That's at least in my imagination, which is not necessarily accurate. So I really appreciated reading that portion of the book where you talk about how he warms his back in the sun. He'd get a massage. He'd lean against a post or a wall. Sometimes meditators don't want to use a wall or use a chair or use some kind of backrest because they feel that they need to be adhering to some particular image, right?
Yes.
And so when we see, even the Buddha used a back support from time to time. That was very touching for me. So just continuing with this line of thinking of just the ordinariness of the Buddha as a person, can you maybe walk us through a typical day in the life of the Buddha?
Yes, I don't give a full chapter on that because there's so much. And actually, since I wrote it, people have very kindly pointed out things that I could have put in, but I missed. And in later editions, I may very well include some other stuff. So it seems from the information there that the Buddha only slept very briefly during the night. So he woke up before dawn. And I suppose when there was enough light, he would go for Pindapata, depending on where he was. And then he says in one place that he would, after his meal, he would go somewhere and do his morning meditation. And some of the information he gives about that is very interesting. For example, he says that he would put his robe over his eyes or over his head, which I used to do when I meditate. He doesn't say why, but I imagine that it was maybe the early morning cold, in some seasons perhaps, maybe to shelter his eyes from the light, as some meditators even today do, or maybe because of mosquitoes or insects. It doesn't say. All of those reasons are possible. And before he would sit down, he would collect, once again, depending on where he was, he'd collect some leaves or some grass to make it a little pillow for himself. Or sometimes Ananda or one of his other attendants were following him and they would bring the mat. And sometimes he would carry the mat. And then after his meditation, from that, you can't say there must have been many things he did. There were times when he wanted to go off and just not have to answer questions for the day. He'd go off to one of the shrines in Vaishali. At least on 2 occasions, Ananda would always follow him, but at least on 2 occasions, the Buddha said, don't follow me, I want to be alone. And of course, occasionally he went on 1 month or longer retreats. But anyway, so sometimes in the morning this would happen. He must have done his morning ablutions, cleaning his teeth and what have you. Certainly all the references to him bathing mention that it was in the afternoon, late afternoon. And it mentions him having a bathing cloth around his waist. And then in the afternoons, he would do a range of things. It would seem that he was often on call, people coming to ask him questions. Or another thing that he did, I have all the references in the book, that he would go and visit the sick. And only recently when I was writing this article about the Buddha and healing, did I realize something extremely important. I did a bit of research and I found out that research in the United States has shown that the more loved ones, friends and family visit people in hospitals, the quicker they get out of the hospital. There's a direct relationship between the two. So much so that, hospitals in the United States and even here in Australia, where you used to have specific visiting times, and when the visiting time was out, you had to leave. So some hospitals don't do that anymore because they found that there's a relationship between visiting and the person getting better quicker. Now, of course, this depends on the seriousness of the disease that they're in for. But on a general, overall, this is the case. And in some hospitals now, they even allow patients to, the patient's family to bring the patient's pets, because they apparently have finally realized something that the Buddha knew before, that when you visit people who are sick, chances are, depending on what the complaint is, that they'll get better. Being asked about how you're getting along, the mere fact that you've bothered to come all that way to meet them, and so on. This was good for people, and undoubtedly that's why the Buddha did it so often. So there was another thing he would do. And then a great deal of talking with people. There's one interesting account in the Digha Nikaya where the Buddha obviously wants to be, a little bit, not have to speak to people that day. And a group of eminent Brahmins come, and the Buddha had told his assistant, I'm not to be disturbed. And apparently not used to not getting their own way, they sat down and they said, well, we're going to stay here until he comes. So then another monk comes along and he sees these people sort of sitting down there looking at their watches and what have you. And he asks the Buddha's attendant, tell the Buddha that these people are here waiting to talk to him. And he says, no, because he told me not to disturb him, but you can tell him that if you want. So he goes up, knocks on the door, tells the people, and I suspect the Buddha said, oh, okay. And he went out and met them. So it's interesting and very human, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then in the evening times, after dark, it would seem that he slept very, very late because he asked his monastic disciples to remain awake on the 2 watches of the night, meaning that they should sleep on 1 watch of the night. Exactly how long that is, I have it in the book. So presumably he only slept for one watch of the night each night. So that
Would
would
one
have been,
watch be about 2 hours?
I can't quite remember now. Depend on the season, because some seasons you get more daylight than others. There's one thing that the Buddha used to do, which I did not mention, and that is, he would usually get his meals through by going for alms round, pindapata. But at other times he would, and this apparently happened the more famous he became, that he would be invited to somebody's home for a meal. And there is in the Sela Sutta quite an interesting account of how the Buddha would conduct himself during such invitations, that he would sit in a particular way, wash his bowl in his hand afterwards, and give a brief talk and thanks at the end of the meal. And if you read in the Vinaya, he actually makes certain suggestions of how monks should behave at such times. For example, they shouldn't have sort of so much food that their cheeks were, and they shouldn't pick up the cup if they've got curry on their hands, and all those sorts of polite behavior as you would expect of somebody who was an honoured guest. So there's quite a lot of things, but there are others in the chapter.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And one thing that I really enjoyed is how in Footprints in the Dust, it reveals how the Buddha used puns, irony, and even satire to diffuse tensions and open people's minds up for more serious teachings. Can you share a couple of your favorite examples of how he did this?
I do say in the book, and it is true, it's hard to know when the Buddha was being, the puns are clear enough, but semi-humorous comments or slightly humorous comments, it's hard to know whether that's actually what they were, because it's very, very difficult, not knowing the culture in which you're talking about, to know what was humorous or not. But I think I've identified some which may very well have been meant to be humorous. And the one that sticks to mind is when King Ajatasattu asked the Buddha the question, can you show me some advantage of the spiritual life which can be seen here and now? In itself, that's an interesting question. Kings, particularly in those days, were not interested in theories or in that. Show me the evidence. Okay, so that's what he's saying. And so the Buddha says, well, if you had a slave and he ran away and then you found out where he was, would you send your men to arrest him and bring him back? And the king said, no, far from it. If he was a monk, I would, if I saw him, I would bow to him. And the Buddha said, well, there you go. There's an advantage of the monk's life which can be seen here and now. Now, I take that to be light, not necessarily humorous, but light-hearted. And I could imagine that it may have at least, first of all, maybe kings are not always so bright. He may not have got the point straight away, but when he did, he may have smiled. And then, of course, the Buddha went on to answer that question much more seriously. And you find, like in the Ganya Sutta, there are quite a lot of interesting puns, which are sort of a slight poke at Brahmins. And of course, you get that very much in the Brahmajala Sutta, the story about God having to admit that he doesn't know everything. That's clearly meant to be humorous. And that would be one of the very few examples where it is very, very clear that the Buddha was pulling their leg a bit.
So even though the Buddha had this gentle humor and ability to make people smile, he did discourage his students from making jokes and from laughing out loud. Why do you think there was this kind of contradiction?
Yeah, well, perhaps this is another aspect of the Buddha's character, which goes against the grain of what many people think about the Buddha. Was he was a bit of a prude. he he thought that dancing and singing and that was frivolous and waste of time. And as you correctly say, I mean, to his son, he said, you shouldn't lie even as a joke. I think that's a bit much. I mean, I think a few jokes every now and then don't matter. So, but you're quite correct. In the Anguttara Nikaya, he actually says to monks, you can smile, or it's okay to smile as long as you don't show your teeth. Oh, come on, Lord Buddha, this is a bit much, isn't it? So it may be that at some particular time he said that. Perhaps he'd had a bad day. And also, I think it's important to point out that the spiritual life is a serious one. I think there is a time, and perhaps in some circumstances, a role for humor. Mm-hmm. But samsara it's not a happy place. Much of it is not a laughing matter. And this was the Buddha's purpose for being, as he says many times. You know, he came, or he teaches, for the good of the many, for the happiness of many, out of compassion for the world. It's a serious problem, and you need to bring to it a serious attitude. So, although it seems as a contradiction, I think it's not a particularly important one. There are at least two places where people point out that, in contrast to the other monks of the time, the other ascetics of the time, the Buddha's disciples seem to be so relaxed, at ease, at peace with themselves, and smiling.
You depict the Buddha as an excellent debater. Why was it necessary for him to enter into debates with teachers from other traditions? Can you explain the reasoning behind that, and maybe also say something about his debating style?
Yes, so we know from other literature, contemporary or roughly contemporary literature, that society at the time of the Buddha was to some degree like society in Greece a little bit later, where a significant percentage of the population were quite interested in philosophical and religious ideas, and they had a tradition of public debates. There were some places that actually had halls especially for discussing various views, and apparently there were events, occasional events, where large groups of people would congregate to hear different teachers expressing different points of view. They were a very popular form of entertainment. And it is clear from, particularly in the Upanishads, you get this, very similar to what's in the Tipitaka, only the Tipitaka has more information on the accepted rules of how you would conduct yourself during one of these debates. And the reason why the Buddha participated in them was, once again, sometimes because he was challenged, sometimes because perhaps he had heard certain teachings and he wanted to give his perspective, sometimes because people had willfully misrepresented what he said and he wanted to clarify things, and sometimes simply because he wanted people to know what he had to say. So it must have been intellectually quite an interesting time. We know in later periods in India, this tradition continued, only in certain places at certain times it became rather unpleasant, in that if you were challenged to a debate, you may have to participate, and if you were considered to have lost, you might have been in very serious trouble. There were actually periods where you would be executed. That was if a king had ordered a debate. Perhaps the king didn't know himself, but he wanted to hear the 2 points of view. And if you lost, there were cases where the loser was executed. There's no evidence of that at the time of the Buddha. But if you read in the Sutta Nipata, it's very clear that early in the Buddha's career, he wasn't interested in this. In quite a few places, particularly in the Attaka Wagga, towards the end of the Sutta Nipata, it says the wise person doesn't get involved in debates. But we know from the Digha and everywhere else that the Buddha did. So I would suggest that probably early on he realized that he was not going to be able to just present his teaching and leaving it at that. If it was going to have an honest and wide hearing, it had to be explained, it had to be justified. Always the Buddha conducted himself according to the accepted rules, and that he always was polite. But he was also firm. Once again, he would hold some religious ideas up for, in-depth scrutiny, and sometimes they were found wanting. Well, one thing he did in several of the debates in the Digha Nikaya was that he would accept the categories that the opponent or the opposition presented, but then he would give them a very different meaning. That was one of his techniques. So he would appear in the beginning to agree with you, but then very gradually, step by step, show you that his position on that particular point was different. Probably, here's a good example. It's not a debate, but it's a teaching strategy. When, what was his name? Sigula, the Buddha saw him with his hair wet, asked him what he was doing. And he said, well, before my father, all his life, he worshipped the 4 directions or 6 directions. And he told me, after I'm gone, you should do the same. So that's what he was doing. He was worshipping the 6 directions, which is actually mentioned in the Upanishads as a practice. And the Buddha didn't mock him and say, oh, what a waste of time, because he realized this guy was honoring his father's wishes. In other words, what he was doing was, or why he was doing it, was a good thing. But the Buddha couldn't possibly agree with the idea that worshipping the 6 directions had any spiritual value. So he didn't pull it down. He said, well, I do that too, or I teach my students that too, only I do it slightly differently. And then, of course, he presented his, what you might call his ethics of relationships. So, and you see the Buddha sometimes doing that in actual debates. So when he said he was a Satta Deva Manu, I think that's actually very true. He was a very, very skillful debater. He was a very skillful teacher. He was a teacher of gods and humans.
And as a teacher of humans, what might be some key differences in how the Buddha taught monastics versus lay people?
I don't know that there's a difference. I think the main difference would have been in the contents. I think this is a point that a lot of people miss with Buddhism. It seems to me very clear that the Buddha saw the spiritual life as having a primary goal and secondary goals. So the primary goal, of course, would have been, without any debate, attaining enlightenment. But if you read I mean, the first thing you notice when you read the suttas is how frequently the Buddha talked about what we would normally call non-spiritual things. Like, for example, the Sigalovada Sutta, how to treat the people you have relationships with. Or one of my favorites is good reasons for cleaning your teeth. I mean, he talked about a lot of these things. And some of those things were relevant primarily to lay people, but some of them were relevant to anybody because they were about how to live your life. So he taught this primary goal, but he taught many secondary goals too. How to be a decent husband, how to be a good parent, how to maintain your health, how to diffuse problems you might have with your neighbors, and so on. All the sorts of things that any ordinary people would have. And incidentally, if you think the monastic life was one of just sweetness and light, it's very clear from reading the Vinaya that that was not the case. Monks quite often had tensions and divisions and what have you too. So some of that was relevant to monks, some of it relevant to lay people, some of the things he taught. So the secondary goals could be polite, to be a good citizen, a responsible husband or wife, an honest businessman, but also in the case of business, a successful businessman too. It's surprising how much he talked about that. So I think it's important to realize that you had this idea of primary goals and secondary goals, and that the purpose of the primary goals was also to help to create a more just and fair society, but also as a template for moving upwards to gradually towards the primary goal. That the secondary goals were not just there for worldly reasons, they were there for spiritual reasons too. So if you look at it like that, many things the Buddha taught were relevant primarily to lay people, less so to monastics. But there is some overlapping between the two.
So earlier you talked about how the suttas describe what the Buddha looked like. And so I'm very much curious about that, what the Buddha must have looked like, because all the representations of him are colored by the cultural or the ethnic lens of the artist. So based on what we have in the early suttas, can you paint a portrait of what the Buddha might have looked like? Did he possess those 32 marks of a supreme being, or is that something that was just added later on as the Buddha story developed?
Well, this is quite interesting that, for example, if you look at the Bible, we have absolutely no description whatsoever of what Jesus looked like. So the images we have of Jesus nowadays, it simply is guesswork. Whereas in the case of the Buddha, you have really quite a detailed account of him. So we know how tall he was, for example. Oh, sorry, that's not true. We know that he was slightly taller than his half-brother. Unfortunately, we know exactly how much higher he was. I think it's 2 angulis, 2 finger breadths. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't know how tall his half-brother was. But anyway, we have that. And we have at least 3 descriptions of people who describe him as exceptionally handsome. Of course, that would have been according to his age at the time. But I sort of suspect he looks something like Shah Rukh Khan or something like that. So he was probably looking like a contemporary Indian, not particularly dark, but it's a cafe au lait colour. It's often described as being golden, pretty much as we refer to somebody as having a golden complexion today. There are 2 accounts of when he is believed to have radiated light, but only 2 accounts. And well, perhaps we'll come back to that a little later. So the descriptions we have of him are as of a particularly attractive male. There's also an interesting description of him, of which he includes some information about what he looked like when he was old. So I've often pointed out that when you see a depiction of the Buddha, its final nirvana, he looks like he's about 25. Well, that's not how he described himself, that he was hunched, that his muscles were drooping and flabby, pretty much like my neck, I suppose. Etc. So the Tipitaka is much more realistic and to the point than contemporary art is, or even ancient art. The Buddha had no shaved. He described himself as being bald or shaven-headed. So he must have shaved his face also. What else?
And what about these 32 marks of a
Oh, the 32 marks, yes. Yeah. Well,
can you share what some of those marks are?
Yes. Well, once again, I've just written an article on the Buddha's hair, of all things. So one of the 32 marks is that in every pore on his body, there's only one hair, and it turns to the left. Another one is that his hands come down to his knees. Another one is that his tongue is so long that he can actually lick his forehead. I'd really like to see that. And all of them are very, very strange, and nobody's really ever explained the origin of this. Although Powers has written a book called Bull of Man, A Bull of a Man, it's called, which is, I think, the most detailed study of this. In the suttas itself, it is described as being a Brahminical concept. And yet no Brahminical text that we know of mentions it. Anyway, whatever it is, if the Buddha really looked like that, I suspect that his midwives would have drowned him as soon as he was born. And we know from so many other accounts that in all respects he was physically pretty much the same as us. For example, when, what was his name? The ascetic he met just after his enlightenment, he could see from a distance that there was something different about this person who was approaching him along the road to Gaya. His poise, how he held himself, and apparently his complexion. And when the two finally met, he said, your face is so calm and serene. Who is your teacher? And he said, well, I don't have a teacher. So clearly, if the Buddha had had all these other marks, that ascetic would have noticed it and would have mentioned it. There was the other case where the young man who had never met the Buddha was spending the night in a potter's shed. And as it so happened, there was another ascetic staying there at the same time. And the two of them had a discussion for some time. And this young man said, well, I'm on my way to find the Buddha because I've heard that he's a wonderful teacher and I want to meet him. And they have this discussion for some time. And it's only later that the young man realizes that he's talking to the very person he was looking for. Once again, had the Buddha had these strange signs, this young man would have noticed it immediately and known that he was in the company of a very unusual and rather strange person. Mm-hmm. So I think that this was one of several things in the suttas that we have to ascribe to a later period, although definitely at an early period. As to why the Buddhists would have included this, I think Venerable Sujato, Bhante Sujato, in his book on the early Buddhist texts, has a very, very good, quite a credible explanation. That is, the first, second, or third generations of Buddhists wanted to recommend the Dhamma to the Brahmin class. And so the Brahmin class said, no, as far as we're concerned, you can't be a teacher. What marks you out as special is your physical characteristics. And so the early Buddhists decided, well, our teacher used to have those too. I think that's a credible explanation as to why this very unusual concept was adopted by the early Buddhists and included in the Tipitaka.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are excellent explanations. And then for you as a scholar, how do you balance that historical accuracy with the mythology or this reverence associated with the Buddha's life?
Well, when you write a book like mine and you don't really mention too many of those things, you will find that people will say, well, this is typical. The bits you don't like, you just leave out. But it seems to me that all biographers do that. I mean, if you read a very good biography of, say, George Washington, they won't mention the bit about him chopping down the cherry tree. Why? Because we know it's not true. When you read a biography of Isaac Newton, you won't find anything about an apple falling on his head. Why? Because we know that it's a funny story, it's interesting, and it actually makes a point quite well, but it's not included because we know it's not true. So I think with some common sense and some knowledge of what society was like at the time of the Buddha and how the Tipitaka was eventually put together, I think we can, I think any intelligent person can tell the difference between the mythological parts in the Tipitaka and the other ones. But this is another important thing. Not one of those things is central to the Dhamma. Now, whether the Buddha flew from Shravasti to Vaishali, we could debate that. But one thing we could say for certain, it has absolutely nothing to do with practicing the Dhamma. It is not an essential feature of the Dhamma. So in some religions, the fact that the saint can walk on water or he rose from the dead, well, that is absolutely crucial. It is central to that religion. The Buddha flying from here to there or etc. isn't in any way. It's just an aside, a colourful aside. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Nice. Well said. Thank you, Bhante. Now we'll take some questions from the audience and you can answer.
Was probably never meant for the majority of people. It looks like at some early time somebody has culled interesting sayings of the Buddha and put them all in one book, and probably for new recruits, new monks, to learn by heart. So when you actually read the Dhammapada, really most of it is about things that are relevant and important to monks, which is quite okay. But it's very interesting when you look at how many important aspects of the Dhamma get no mention in the Dhammapada. For example, the word metta. I think metta is pretty important in Buddhism. It's only mentioned once in the Dhammapada. The word compassion, pretty important thing too. It's not mentioned once in the Dhammapada. So what I did was I thought, wouldn't it be good if there was a collection of easily remembered, interesting and beautifully written and relevant quotations from the Buddha that people could use like the Dhammapada, become well known and quoted. So I went through the Tipitaka and I culled, I can't remember now, I think it's 210 verses. which would be relevant to the average person. And the average person, the average Buddhist, is not a monk or a nun. So I included some of the more relevant to the ordinary person verses from the Dhammapada, but others as well, including from the Jatikas. And some of these are really quite interesting. So the whole purpose of the book was to present more aspects of the Dhamma that would be relevant to the average and the ordinary person. So there are things like, I wish I'd have heard this question before, because now I can't remember. There's a chapter on mindfulness. There's a chapter on thinking about yourself and others, not just yourself. I think there's 2 chapters on metta. I think there's a chapter on right speech, etc. So I think all of those ones make available to people a much wider presentation of the Dhamma than you would usually get in the Dhammapada, which for various reasons is probably the most well-known, most quoted of the Buddha's saying. So that was the purpose of it. And I think I can't really remember offhand one saying or one quotation. I think most of them would be of use and of interest and of value to the reader.
Thank you. We can call that the Dhammika Pada.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, very good. I like that.
So speaking of metta, another question here is, what did the Buddha say about conditional versus unconditional love?
He didn't say anything about
unconditional love even possible?
Yeah, the Buddha said nothing about unconditional love. And it's perhaps an unusual question because, one of the central points of Buddhism is that everything is conditioned. And I can't see why love shouldn't be conditioned too. And it's very clear that love is conditioned. I don't know anywhere. So the Buddha talked about various qualities of metta, its expansiveness and etc., its ability to trigger joy and what have you in that. But I know of the only unconditional thing the Buddha talked about was Nibbana, of course. And I mean, you only really have to give it a little bit of thought. Unconditional love? Well, I think in my book on love, I give some examples of this. I've often heard newly married people say, oh, my husband or my wife loves me unconditionally. And 5 years later, you hear that they're involved in a very unpleasant divorce proceedings. So obviously there were some conditions that arose that changed the very intense love that they had previously. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that simply because love, like all psychological states and all phenomena, is unconditioned, that doesn't mean that it's not important or that it doesn't rob it of its beauty. It is a very, very important thing, but like all states, it's conditioned. So then when you look at what the Buddha has to say about how to evoke or trigger or enhance love, clearly he's giving you conditions that may make your ability to express metta more. Because like all conditioned states, if you can identify some of the conditions that give rise to it, then you're walking down the right path.
Thank you for that. So the next question here, it says on page 144 of Footprints in the Dust, Bhante mentioned that the Sangha in the Triple Refuge vow doesn't refer to monks and nuns, but to anyone who has realized the stages of enlightenment.
Ah, yes.
Is this really based in the suttas or Vinaya Pitaka?
So when we chant the 3 important passages which itemize the characteristics first of the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, iti piso, bhagava, araham, and so on. It very clearly says there that the taking refuge in the Sangha refers to taking refuge in anybody who has attained at least the first stage of enlightenment, that is, somebody who's a Sotapanna. That's very clear. But I am told, I've never checked it myself, but I'm told that there are a few places in the Tripitaka where it seems to suggest that the Bhikkhu Sangha, I don't think there's anywhere where it's the Bhikkhuni Sangha, it's only the Bhikkhu Sangha, you take refuge in the Bhikkhu Sangha. So we seem to have two different approaches there. It seems to me quite possible that the original was that you take refuge in those who have reached the stage where enlightenment now becomes inevitable. Mm-hmm. And so chances are you could learn an awful lot from a person like that, perhaps even not necessarily learn something, but simply be inspired and impressed by their behavior in certain circumstances. Whereas that may not be, it's less likely to be the case with an unenlightened human being. So it would seem to me that taking refuge in the Buddha and taking refuge in the Dhamma, that certainly makes sense to me. But taking refuge in an unenlightened person, somebody who could be really nice now, but 6 months from now be not so nice, or that could be nice today, but because of some unforeseen circumstances became really nasty tomorrow, can't see much point in that. I mean, once again, a very good member of the Sangha could certainly do that, but not necessarily. But in the case of somebody who had reached the first stage of enlightenment, that I could understand. So I think probably it's good to consider that when we say Swakato, Bhagavata, Dhammo, Sanditiko, Akaliko, and so on, we're referring to those who have attained the first stage of enlightenment. There is a problem there, of course. When you do become a Sotapanna, you don't sort of get a badge, or so we don't know. It's less. I mean, it's easy to know if somebody's a monk or a nun, but it's not so easy to know when they are on their way to full enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people do wear badges, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, and some people do make that claim too.
Yeah. So in connection to that question of lay people versus monastics and awakening, somebody writes here, good day, Bhante. Your work is very inspiring. I have a long desire to become a monk, but currently I cannot pursue this path as I am married with children. My belief is that only through renunciation can we achieve the final goal of Nibbana. The Buddha said that the path of the layperson is a crowded, dusty one, which I understand to mean that it's almost impossible to attain Nibbana as a layperson. Mm-hmm. Is this understanding correct? Is it possible to achieve Nibbana as a layperson?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, my advice would be don't tell your wife that you want to dump her and become a monk. Okay, that probably wouldn't be received very happily. Okay. So I think this is the first thing: is that basically what you said is relatively correct. So there are certainly cases in the Tripitaka where lay people have attained Sotapanna or have become Sakadagamis and whatever. I can't think of anywhere they actually attained enlightenment, but that doesn't matter. Once you've attained that first state, then enlightenment becomes inevitable. It's like demolishing a wall. You can chip away at it at the top or the bottom or something, but if you chip it at the bottom, it's going to fall down. Okay?
Eventually.
It might take 5 minutes. It might shake for a while, but it's eventually going to fall down. It's the same with becoming a Sotapanna. But let's face it, it is true that having a spouse and children and a mortgage and perhaps problems with your boss or your neighbor and that, it's definitely not going to be easy. There's no doubt about that. So that's the first thing that I'd say. The second thing I would say is, if you think that simply putting on a yellow robe, man, all those difficulties and problems disappear and it's just sweetness and light from ever after, that's not the case either. You only have to read in the Vinaya to see that even at the time of the Buddha, monks they were quarreling with each other and putting each other down. And at the best, of course, there was harmony and what have you and that. But the mere fact that the Buddha mentions so frequently and gives advice on how monks and nuns can live together in harmony indicates that it certainly didn't always happen. And having lived in monasteries for more than 40 years, I know that that is the case. So I think this is what you need to do. You need to consider that, good or bad or right or wrong, you're in this position now. What aspects of the Dhamma can you cultivate now? What aspects of the Dhamma can you get to know better? What aspects of your behavior you can change so they're more in harmony with what the Buddha taught about, rather than saying, oh, there's nothing I can do, goodness, I wish my wife would die and that way I'd be free. I think that's a very unconstructive way to think about the spiritual life. And a third thing I'd say is that I know in Sri Lanka, where I think I know Buddhism as it is actually practiced better than, say, Burma and Thailand, where I've spent far less time, is that occasionally you come across somebody who's led an ordinary life, but they've been very, very pious and that, and maybe their husband or their wife has died, or their husband and wife are now being looked after by the children, looking after the grandchildren or something, and living with the kids and that. And then, in other words, they've done what has to be done as a layperson. Now their duties are far, far less, and their responsibilities are less, and then they join the Sangha. And they spend their last days, their last decades or something, doing some of the things that they were unable to do before. So I think that's another. So that Hindu idea of the ashramas, you start off as a student and then you become a householder, and then when you become old, or at least when your responsibilities, your familial responsibilities are far less, then you become an ascetic or you renounce the world. I think it's actually not a bad idea. And I know, at least in Sri Lanka, some people do that. Mm-hmm. So there are the three things I would say about that.
Okay, thank you.
In the book, it's mentioned that, your book, Footprints in the Dust, it's mentioned that the Buddha talked about his teachings being like a raft that can be used to cross the river. And once you cross the river, there's no point in hanging on to it anymore. What exactly does that mean? For instance, if someone achieves stream entry or nibbana, is it the case they don't have to follow his teachings anymore? Can you please clarify?
Yeah, no, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is whether you've attained the first state or you haven't, don't cling to the Dhamma. And in the Alagadupama Sutta, the sutta on the simile of the snake, the Buddha highlights what he means by that. Using the Dhamma to knock others down or to enhance your ego, or just because you love quibbling about little points of Dhamma, or you want to show how much you know, etc. They are the results of not of practicing the Dhamma, but clinging to it. Mm-hmm. So that's what that means. I think some people think that, now I know the Dhamma, I can drop it, I can, light up a joint every now and then and have a few boozes, and they should be okay. No, I don't think that's what that means at all.
Good. In the suttas, the Buddha was depicted as an undefeated debater. Obviously, it has to be this way from a Buddhist point of view. But what of the Jains or his contemporaries' sacred texts? Are there any accounts where the Buddha was shown to be
Very good
defeated
question.
fate according to their texts?
Very, very good question. That's a very interesting question. Yeah. So in the last 10 years, I think I'm very familiar with early Buddhist literature. You can see here I've got the English translation and here the original Pali. I read them virtually every day, and I think without boasting I can say I know them pretty well. So in the last 10 years, what I've done is I've started exploring early Vedic literature and some of the Brahmana Shastras and the Dhamma Sutras, which are roughly contemporary with North India, roughly contemporary with the Buddha. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And the religion that I focus more so on than the Vedic literature is Jain literature, which is a real eye-opener. You see in some ways how similar Jainism is to Buddhism. And you rarely hear people say that. How many times have I heard people say the Buddha was influenced by or even copied some things from Hinduism? I can't see very much evidence for that. But he very may well have been influenced by Jainism. And I think the fact that in the Tripitaka, you certainly do get a feeling of, if not hostility, then competitiveness between Jains and Buddhists. And I think the reason for that is because they were so close. Okay, so there's not a single reference to Buddhism in the sacred canonical literature of Jainism. Now that sounds rather unusual, because the Jain doctrines and Jain teachers and Mahavira is mentioned very frequently in Buddhist literature. Why would this be so? I don't know. But I'll give a possible explanation. First of all, Jain literature, the Jain canon actually disappeared. Their explanation is that at some time there was a great famine in India, and the oral tradition died out. And so they had to try to reconstruct that with varying degrees of accuracy. In the process, it would seem that anything that may have been references to the Buddha and to Buddhism wasn't included, or they couldn't remember them. And the other problem is the two sects of Jainism, the Svetambaras and the Digambaras, they're quite different. The relationship between each other is quite different from the relationship between, say, Theravada and Mahayana. When I went to Singapore, I was invited to teach in a Mahayana monastery. So there was in the past competitiveness between early Buddhism and Mahayana, but downright hostilities, that seems to have been not particularly common. But the two sects of Jainism, they hardly talk to each other. They don't get along very well at all, which is a great tragedy. And so they also have very different views about how much of their sacred literature they were able to reconstruct after it disappeared. So that's the first thing. Now, here's one explanation. If you read Confucian literature, okay, written by Confucian scholars, they have very, very few references to Buddhism. And yet they, at various times, they existed in environments where Buddhism was actually more influential than Confucianism. Now, I've read several explanations for that, and one of them is that the Confucianists had utter contempt for Buddhism. Well, they're so contemptuous, we wouldn't even lower ourselves to talk about them. That's the explanation that I've heard. There may have been something like this in Jainism. That is, look, we don't have time to talk about these other people and that. We want to talk about what we believe and what we feel is important. So that's one thing. Non-canonical Jain literature, which of course dates from a much later period, they sometimes do have references not to the Buddha, but to Buddhists and Buddhist ideas. They're usually critical, but that's not the canonical literature. That's from many centuries later. So the answer to your question is there's virtually no reference to the Buddha or Buddhism in the sacred canons of Jainism.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Well, may I just mention one thing?
Of course.
I visited India quite a few times, stayed there for extended periods and traveled widely. And I have always found a serious problem with Jains. And that is, they are so nice. They are so willing, delighted to meet a Buddhist monk. They are so accommodating and everything that sometimes it's hard to get away from them. When I visited the place where Mahavira died, there are some pilgrims' rests there. And when the manager of one of these pilgrims' rests saw me, he said, "Oh, no, come and stay in the monastery." And I only wanted to be there for a day and leave the next day. And they simply wouldn't let me leave. "No, stay here, we'll look after you. We're so delighted to have you." My experience with Jains in India has always been very, very positive. And I have a very high regard for Jainism. Several other places. Palitana, I went there. Same thing happened. "No, don't leave. Stay here. We want to look after you."
Yeah. Likewise, I've had really positive experience with Jains. Yeah.
I remember when I was in Mount Abu, I went to those absolutely beautiful Dalgari temples on the top of the mountain, and I walked all the way from the town. And when I got there, the gate was closed, and it said, "You've got to come back at 3:00. Oh. So I spoke to the guard at the gate, and I said, "Why can't I come in?" And he said, "No, you must come back at 3:00. And I said, "I want to speak to the manager." So he said, "Oh, okay." So he let me in, and as soon as the manager saw me, he said, he stood up and said, "Oh, please take a seat. Yeah, what can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I walked all the way from the town. I'd really like to have a look at it." "Of course you can."
That's funny.
If you ever have the opportunity to go to Mount Abu, these temples are just absolutely breathtaking. They're beautiful.
Great. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. So another question here is, Bhante mentioned in his book that the Acharya Bhutta Sutta, MN 123, is admittedly late. I always find this sutta bordering on hagiography. On what ground can we know that it's a late edition? Is it because of the reference to the Bodhisattva, which early text normally reserves for the period where Gautama went forth?
Okay.
I guess the question is, how do we know if a sutta is late or early?
Yeah. Well, you're referring to the Acharya Bhutta Dhamma Sutta, which is in the Majjhima Nikaya, and it is an account of the Gautama's birth. And you've asked the question, how do we know that it's a later edition?
Mhm.
And very clearly, you're familiar with it. You'll know that virtually everything it says is simply not credible, and not mentioned in any of the other sources in earlier suttas. So I think the contents tells us that. However, in my book, I have written that there may be an explanation for at least some of the things that are supposed to have taken place when Gautama was born. I think the most interesting one I mention in the book is, it says that when Gautama emerged from his mother's womb, a great effulgent light shot out into the universe, so that even in the dark intergalactic space between the world systems, even there that light could be seen. And beings that lived in all that darkness suddenly were able to become aware of themselves. So I'll go out on a limb here and say that whoever composed that was, in a most dramatic way, saying that the advent of the Buddha would allow human beings to have the opportunity to get to know, to become aware of each other in ways that are different than they would normally. So I think if that is a literary concept, perhaps the others are literary concepts too. I think it's a fairly well-known thing that Indian literature, particularly early Indian literature, tends to exaggerate many things. I think Indian sweets tell you a lot about Indian culture. So yes, I know you know what I'm talking about. So if you eat a barfi, for example, or some of these, I mean, it's not just sweet. It's like a hand on the head sweet. Indians like this alankara, it's called in Sanskrit literature, decoration. And so I think that particular sutta, the Acharya Bhuttadhamma Sutta, is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. So we just have a few more minutes. There's a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one or two more. You mentioned that you live in a forest on a small island. How do you get your food, medicine, and other requisites? If someone wishes to make an offering to you, what is the best way to do so?
Well, nobody here makes offerings to me because there's nobody here that I know of who's interested in Buddhism. So I have there's some shop some distance away from me. I have a bicycle, and I go to the supermarket there. It's not a very good supermarket, and I buy my food. As for other requisites, if I, for example, need a new robe, I asked people in Singapore if they could post one to me. Mm-hmm. And so that's I'm pretty much self-contained. And the reason I live here is because, as opposed to, say, in a temple in Melbourne or Sydney or something like that, is when I returned to Australia, I'd been away for over 40 years. And when I left Australia, there was no such thing as Medicare, ID cards, tax file number, all those sorts of things, which you actually need to survive in a society like this. And I knew that it would be extremely difficult for me to get back in the system. You know, as far as the system was concerned, I didn't exist. In fact, a year before I left, I had what I could only describe as a threatening letter from the Australian tax authorities saying, you know, we noticed that you haven't paid tax since 1973. Explain. And then there was a big thing about You can be fined either $10,000 and 6 years in prison or both, and blah, 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 blah. Oh, my God. Anyway, they gave me a number. I rang, and they were quite nice when I explained, well, I haven't lived in the country for more than 40 years. Oh, that's all right then. Listen, go to our website, but press this button, fill in that, blah, 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 and you won't hear from us again. Exactly 12 months later, I heard from them again, making the same threat. And it had only taken them 40 years for them to figure out that I hadn't paid tax. How was that?
They noticed the person walking around in a Buddhist monk's robe.
Yes. Anyway, so that was a problem I had, and so I moved here because at that time my brother lived nearby, and I realized that it would be very difficult to get somebody to help me and negotiate my way through all this. So I simply moved here simply because in fact, I stayed with him for quite some time. And so that's how it happened that I was here. But now that I am here, I find it very conducive to doing my writing. It's very quiet here. Kangaroos visit my garden every evening. There's some lovely birds live nearby. In fact, these beautiful multicolored parrots come to the tree nearby me. There's some sort of fruit that they like, and they're very, very noisy little guys, but it's a delight to see them. So I find it I'm a forest monk without being, an ultra strict forest monk, you might say.
Yeah. Great. And so just one last question. So is there any upcoming Dhamma book in the works?
Yes. A book that I hope Pariyatti might be interested in. I've pretty much finished it. It will be called The Buddha in History, Culture and Art, or History, Tradition and Art. And it will be looking at the essay I mentioned about how the Buddha spoke, the essay on the Buddha's hair, and some others, and a new article that I've just, the one about the Buddha and medicine, healing, nursing, and what have you. So I hope that will come out maybe sometime next year. And a long-term project that when I have free time, I work on. I would like to write a book on society at the time of the Buddha as depicted in the Tripitaka and other near contemporary literature. So I've already accumulated a huge amount of information. When I have the time, I hope to be able to put it in order and have that published too. But that will be a major project. Yeah. So, for example, I've already done something on games. You may know that in the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha talks about, in fact, he mentions about, I think it's 10 games that monks should not play. So I've written about that. I recently found out some fascinating things about divorce in ancient India. There's a very interesting incident mentioned in the Vinaya where a man finds out that his wife has got herself a boyfriend and he's not very pleased. So he tells her, drop it or else there'll be trouble. She takes no notice of him. So he goes to the ruling council in Vaishali and explains the situation. And he said, I want to kill her. I'm going to murder her. And they say to him, exercise your right. And she hears about this and she makes herself very scarce very quickly. She races off to Kosala. So that's very interesting. First thing it tells us is that if a man found out that his wife was committing adultery, he may not necessarily want to divorce her. He may want to second chance for her. So that's interesting. It's interesting that he didn't just murder her. He felt that it would be best to go to the ruling council, because perhaps if he murdered her, he might be in trouble for murder. So he wanted to get the permission from the authorities. The third thing it tells you is that such councils could very well give you that permission. So that tells us something about, at least at that part of the world at that time, of how these things happen. So I hope to put all that in, and where relevant, give the Buddha's comments on some of these things, what he thought about them, whether that influenced how he presented his Dhamma and what have you. But this will be 7 or 8 years, maybe 10 years. It's a long-term project. So they're
Good retirement project.
What's that?
Good retirement project.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, this has really been fun. So thank you so much for your time. I think the audience really appreciated the interview and the questions and answer session. It's been really great. So thank you so much.
Well, I'd like to thank Pariyatti for arranging it, and also those of you who submitted questions. I think they were all interesting questions, and I hope
we only got through half of them, unfortunately. But
oh, really? Okay, okay.
So
What can
we'll have
we
to have
do?
another event sometime soon.
Right. Okay, then. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bhante.
Thank you so much, Venerable Dhammika and Kory, for joining us today. On behalf of Pariyatti, I would like to thank all of you for attending this event. As a small, resource-limited, nonprofit organization, we rely on volunteers to help us wherever possible. And today's event would not have been possible without the generous support of Tina Savla. So thanks again for your help. It is much appreciated. When you leave this meeting, you'll be presented with the opportunity to fill out a short post-event survey. The link to the same survey will be posted in the Zoom chat box. So if you have a few moments, we would appreciate your feedback. Thank you.